support for Saint soon, and there's a couple other products on the roadmap right now that we should be able to get in soon once we have a sample. The cool thing about the structure of Metasploit Express is that we're not just a consumer of data. We can export everything back out. So everything that's being stored in the database internal in Metasploit Express is exact same database schema that's being used in the free version of Metasploit. So they go back and forth. If you do a pen test after enabling the free version of Metasploit and then use the same database for Express, your data's still there. You can export it back out. You can import it back in. And the data exports are either raw XML, which delineate all everything you did in the network, all the commands you ran, all the information about the targets, or you can do a raw XML inside of a zip file with all the data files. That includes all your PW dump files, includes all your screenshots, all your other data from the target network, and that's a great way to give a deliverable to the client. Say, here's exactly what I did, when I did it, how I did it, in a format you can actually parse with a script. One of the major changes in 3.4.0 was really fleshing out the XMLRPC interface that's in the backend of Metasploit. Does anyone here actually use the XMLRPC backend? All right, there's a couple there's 3 people that have actually used it. There's Ryan Lin, who works on the Beef project, and he also works on the Nsploit, the Nmap integration with Metasploit. They both use the XMLRPC, both of those projects use the XMLRPC backend. Basically, everything you can do in Metasploit, you can basically automate through an XMLRPC channel that's encrypted through SSL and authenticated. The Metasploit Express product itself uses the exact same communication channel. It just adds a couple additional APIs on top, and gives you new featers. So once we go through the UI and start demonstrating what it can do and how it does it, everything that we're going to do through the UI, you can now do from the command line through the XMLRPC interface and integrate it with your tools however you want to do it. And it's the same protocol and same stack as open source version, just with a couple of additional APIs on top. So one of the last things, or the third thing I want to talk about is testing with confidence. A lot of folks like using DB Autopwn, which we think is kind of like script kiddie shotgun mode, where it just goes out and fires exploits at everything randomly. I mean, you're more than likely going to shut your whole network down using it, but it's a lot of fun just to see what happens sometimes. It's not something you actually want to use in the customer network in any sense. So when we looked at building Metasploit Express, we realized that the shotgun mode approach exploit launching isn't going to work. And we look at how some other products handled it, and we think we've got a good approach. So first we use reliability rankings to create tiers within the products. We say, here's the ones that are excellent ranking. These are ones that can't crash anything. They're not even overflows. So things like command line injection, they exploit all sorts of fun data access vulnerabilities, but they aren't going to actually trigger an overflow in any sense. Then you look at ones that on the next tier down that are really reliable exploits, where they automatically detect their target, and they're if they don't know the target, they bail out, or when they do know their target, they use an exploit, the return address that's really accurate. And finally, once we do have the list of exploits that are broken into those tiers, we rank them, we order them based on what CVID they're going to be running. And this will be part of beta 3. So we always run the older ones first. So it's going to see what the oldest possible vulnerability you possibly have is first for each ranking, and then use that to break in. It's also going to go through and prevent you from running multiple exploits on the same port at the same time. You're not going to want to run your 2 or 3 different SMB-based exploits across the same SMB service and the same target at the same time, or whichever one happens to work first is going to crash the next one, and the whole thing is going to shut down. So the idea is we want to be safe about it. So in cases where the exploit is not an excellent ranked exploit, it's something where it triggers memory corruption, we make sure we only run exactly 1 exploit per time per service in the order that is least likely to cause a crash before we get a shell. So there's a whole nice analysis system built into it that makes testing a lot safer this way. You can say, I want to run just the excellent ranking ones and not trigger any kind of memory corruption. This system also automatically detects things like printers and routers and crappy switches, and will actually blacklist them automatically from exploits. So if it finds your HP jet direct, it's not going to cause your jet direct to spew pages for 10 days. It's going to figure that out and say, no thanks, it's okay. Now, if you want your jet direct to spew pages, or you're worried about someone actually hiding a banner because they make it look like a printer, you can uncheck that box and move on if you want to. And finally, you can do things like throttle the speed, the concurrency. You can also leverage the smart payload connection stuff. So normally in Metasploit, with every module you run, you have to tell what payload to use, and then that indicates what connection type to use too. Whether it's reverse connect, whether it's a bind shell. Based on the information that we have from the scan, we'll actually look at, if we're on the same local network as the target, we're going to use a reverse connect by default, and that works fine. If the target is behind a firewall, or we see that there's some other kind of rule in place, or we're behind a NAT gateway and the target's not, we're actually going to use the port scan data to figure out what ports are open on the target, automatically use a bind shell on that port, and then use it automatically. So it has a nice little smart allocator that tells you what ports to use based on that. So it saves you another step in Metasploit too, if you're used to the standard interface. And finally, or not finally, but almost finally, I wish I had support for Metasploit. People have been asking for commercial support for a long time. It's something that, where the product is broad as Metasploit is right now, you can't really train anyone to support all of it. I mean, I don't know all the product. I mean, the other guys that work on the project, we all know 80% of it, but there's definitely gaps in between where we have, one of the great things about Metasploit is lots of people contribute to it, so we have lots of functional areas that are just really wide and deep all by themselves. Like, for example, the WMAP backend. It'd be really tough to provide support for WMAP because it's kind of an optional component that's part of the main framework, but not really part of the core. So we looked at how do you want to support this? And what we ended up coming up with is we have full commercial support for Metasploit Express with SLAs. We also provide partial support for Metasploit framework by itself as part of the same contract and same purchase. So for the same purchase price, same yearly contract, you get the SLAs and support for both. And it's limited support for Metasploit framework just because the framework is big enough. You don't want to support MSF encode or MSFP scan the command line. Most cases, you can just go on IRC and ask us anyways, and we'll answer your question. So not too big of a deal. And finally, I wish pen testing software is actually affordable. If you look at the market today, there's a lot of low-end providers that when you actually add in their support cost and yearly maintenance cost, early updates, this and that, the numbers just get huge. We're looking at around like $7,000, $10,000 for most products in the market today with all the updates included for the first year. If you look at the high-end players, you're looking at close to $60,000 as your minimum buy-in for the product. And it doesn't really work very well with small companies and small enterprises. So we're shooting for exactly $3,000 per year per user. So hopefully it's right in the middle. We think it's a good price point. We think it's actually affordable for the small consultants. And we think we're providing enough value to more than justify the price point based on what it does. So a quick jump into the workflow. This is the general process that Metasploit Express goes through. And keep in mind, you can skip steps. You can jump ahead to one, you can move back, you can do anything you want, whatever order you want. But this is the recommended data flow. You start off doing some kind of scan, whether it's our own internal scan engine, which is based on Metasploit modules and Nmap, whether it's importing an Expose or Nmap scan you did yourself, or scan from another supported third-party product. You can actually run an Expose scan directly, load that data into the product automatically, and move on. And you can add devices by hand. So if you don't want to trip an IPS or another box network, you want to be kind of stealthy about it, you can actually add devices by hand into the interface, add nodes, add services, and then launch exploits based on how you configure it as well. So it doesn't necessarily have to have this recon information. It just works better when it's available. The next step you want to do is actually gain access. And this is either through brute forcing, exploiting, or manually exploiting. So for example, if you want to run a client-side exploit, you can you pick the module you want, set it up, it runs as a background task, and your shells show up just like they normally do in the interface for automated exploits. Brute force, it'll actually automatically get a shell unless you tell it not to for every supported service that supports that, like MS SQL, Tomcat, SSH, Telnet, et cetera. And of course, automated exploit engine itself. But the key thing is we realize pen testing isn't just about having exploits. Like most pen testers only use exploits for the first 5–10% of the job, and everything else after that is drilling down, getting information, sifting information, using that information to get to the next step. And that's really where we're trying to go with Metasploit Express. Exploits are great, but the exploits are not going to be the be-all, end-all of a pen test. They never have been. Way too much importance gets put on the existence of 0 days for pen testing because your customer doesn't really care if you use 0 days a lot of times. They're like, great, use something I can't defend against. Do you want a cookie? Like, there's really not much they can do about it. So telling them to use the 0 day for a pen test isn't really fair in a lot of cases. It's a good example of what a real attacker can do, but it's not necessarily fair to them in terms of how they can defend against it, besides doing defense in depth, things like that. So we're not trying to focus entirely on exploits. We think they're important. We're going to keep up to date. We're going to keep funneling resources into it. But we're also going to work on everything else you do during a pen test, which is mostly data analysis, brute force, password reuse, exploiting weak configurations, exploiting weak devices. The great thing about the brute force check is it'll actually bust shells on Cisco's, on printers, on all kinds of random devices by guessing the passwords as well. And then you have an actual interactive shell you can type on and do stuff with, and all your input and output gets logged just like normal in Metasploit Express. So if it guesses a Cisco password and drops you to a Cisco shell, everything you type in that shell and automate is going to get stored and logged just like everything else you do. And if you do the evidence collection on a Cisco device, it's going to do a show config and bring as much data down from the device as it can automatically and include that into the report. So finally, when you actually have your sessions, you can drop to a straight command shell if you want to. You can use the standard interpreter session interface if you like that. We also have a file browser, a VNC plugin, so you go straight to VNC in your browser without having to run anything externally. All sorts of fun kind of automation bits built into the UI for that. And finally, you've got your reporting. So the cool thing about our reporting is you don't have to just do a batch mode reporting. You can look at your live report anytime, anywhere. So if you just do a scan, you want to look at the report of the network, great, pull it up, you're done. If you go through and you do, compromise 5 machines and that's it, you can look at the report of that and generate that report for somebody. Or you can go through and do your full-blown pen test, gather data, gather passwords, break everything possible, get screenshots, and then generate a report with all that data in it as well. It kind of gives you a live snapshot of your existing data from a report sense. If you want a report that's kind of generated and static and doesn't change, we have the ability to generate PDF, Word, and HTML reports in the background, and those work just fine. You can also generate the zip file exports of all of your data as well as your XML, or just your XML as well too. And of course, the idea here is after you get to the step of collecting evidence, you go back around and start your discovery all over again. So what I like to do is after I compromise one machine via SMB and I get a domain account, I'll plug that back into